When you picture the Vietnam War, what do you see? For most of us, it's a swirl of images from the 1960s and 70s. The real fuse for the Vietnam War wasn't lit in the 1960s. With American involvement, it was lit 100 years earlier. It's not by Gias, but by French colonial invaders. American Gias in dense jungles, the constant thump-thump of Huey helicopters, the horror of napalm, and a deeply divided nation back home. It's the story of a century-long fight against foreign domination, a battle for the very soul of a nation. They weren't about to just roll over for these new European masters. A new generation of Vietnamese thinkers, some of whom had been educated in French schools meant to create loyal colonial subjects, were reading dangerous. New ideas about things like revolution, national identity, and self-determination. From the moment the French arrived, resistance movements started to form. He was born Nguyen Sinh Kung, but the world would come to know him as Ho Chi Minh, the French. And later the Americans would learn the hard way that the Vietnamese people had a powerful, deep-seated tradition of taking up arms to defend their homeland. Independence wasn't going to be given, it would have to be taken. For one brief shining moment, it looked like Vietnam's 80-year nightmare of colonial rule was finally ending. With the Japanese defeated and the French still a mess, the Viet Minh didn't hesitate. They seized the moment. On September 2, 1945, in Hanoi's Ba Dinh Square, Ho Chi Minh stood before a massive, cheering crowd and read Vietnam's Declaration of Independence. The French, bankrolled heavily by the United States, who was now terrified of communism spreading, battled the Viet Minh across the country. In fact, this is the moment that sets the stage for America's entry. Before we get into how that happened, if you're getting value from this and want more history that goes beyond the headlines, take a second to hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. It really helps the channel, and you won't miss what's coming next. The French strategy was to hold heavily fortified bases, trying to bait the Viet Minh into a conventional fight where French tanks and artillery could crush them. It wasn't when the first U.S. combat troops landed in '65. Those were just escalations. The war really began with the arrival of French gunships in the 1850s. It began with the theft of land, exploitation of a people, and the crushing of a national identity. The American War was the final tragic and bloody act in a struggle for independence that stretched across generations. And if you forget that first 100 years of conflict, you can never truly understand why the Vietnamese fought so long, so hard, and against such impossible odds. They weren't just fighting for an ideology, they were fighting for Vietnam. The Geneva Accords of 1954 officially ended the First Indochina War. The agreement did a few things. It gave Laos and Cambodia their independence, and it temporarily divided Vietnam in half at the 17th parallel. The Viet Minh would control the north, while the French and their Vietnamese supporters would have the south. But here's the most important part. This division was never meant to be permanent. A national election was scheduled for 1956 to reunite the entire country under one government. It was a fatal mistake. The end came in 1954 at a remote valley outpost called Dien Bien Phu. The French were convinced their base was an untouchable fortress. But the Viet Minh, led by the brilliant General Vo Nguyen Giap, achieved the impossible. And in the Cold War climate, a communist victory anywhere was seen as a threat everywhere, the domino theory. For Ho Chi Minh in the north, it was just the next phase of the same war for independence. They had been fighting against the French. The guerrilla fighters in the south, who became known as the Viet Cong, were organized and supplied by Ho's government in the north. The enemy's flag had changed from French to American, but for them, the goal was exactly the same: kick out the foreign power and finally unify their country. American policymakers were not going to let Vietnam fall. So, instead of letting the election happen, the U.S. poured its support behind a fiercely anti-communist politician named Ngo Dinh Diem, helping him create the brand new country of South Vietnam. The temporary line at the 17th parallel became a hard, militarized border, the new front line of the Cold War. His soldiers and supporters dismantled heavy artillery guns, dragged them piece by piece over mountains, through dense jungle, and secretly reassembled them on the hills overlooking the French. For 56 relentless days, they pounded the French position. Finally, the French garrison was overrun. The shocking defeat at Dien Bien Phu broke France's will to fight, and was the final nail in the coffin of its colonial empire in Indochina. And in a direct, powerful appeal to the West, he started by quoting the American Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The French conquest didn't bring stability. It just planted the seeds for 100 years of war, watering them with resentment and a burning desire for freedom. France, humiliated by its own defeat in Europe, was desperate to claw back its old empire. It refused to recognize Ho's new government. French forces, with some help from British troops, landed in the south and started taking back control. Negotiations between Ho and the French went nowhere and quickly fell apart. In 1930, he united different rebel groups to form the Indochinese Communist Party. But the real game-changer was World War II. French warships responded with a horrific, point-blank bombardment of the city, killing thousands of Vietnamese civilians in a matter of hours. A month later, on December 19, 1946, the Viet Minh hit back, attacking French forces in Hanoi. The First Indochina War was on. In 1940, with France itself crushed and occupied by Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan simply moved in and took over Vietnam. Suddenly, the French colonial bosses were weakened, serving a new master. The Japanese were the new top dogs. And for Vietnamese nationalists, this was a golden opportunity. In 1941, after 30 years away, Ho Chi Minh slipped back into Vietnam. There he founded a new organization, the League for the Independence of Vietnam, which became known as the Viet Minh. The Viet Minh had one simple goal: kick out both the Japanese and the French. They started a guerrilla war, and here's a little twist of irony: they even got help from the United States, who saw them as a useful ally in the war against Japan. And France had set its sights on Southeast Asia, starting in 1858. French forces launched a series of attacks on the Vietnamese Empire. It wasn't a quick blitz. It was a slow, grinding conquest that took decades. It started with missionaries and trade deals, but quickly escalated to warships bombarding coastal cities and troops storming the beaches. It was an 8-point list of demands for the people of Vietnam. It didn't even ask for full independence, just basic human rights. Representation in the French Parliament, freedom of speech, release of political prisoners. He was completely ignored. In 1859, they grabbed the southern city of Saigon. By 1887, they had cemented their control over the whole region, creating a new colony called French Indochina, lumping Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos together under the rule of Paris. To truly get why the war happened, we need to go back to the beginning. And that beginning wasn't in the 1960s. It was in the 1800s. That's the Vietnam War we know. An iconic, tragic, Cold War conflict. But what if that's not the full story? What if the war we remember was just the last violent chapter of a much, much longer struggle? They installed themselves in all the top government jobs, leaving Vietnamese officials to handle the dirty work of managing towns and collecting taxes. Why the whole system was designed for one thing: to make France rich. The colonial government rewired Vietnam's economy to feed its own needs. They created massive plantations to export tobacco, indigo, tea, coffee, and most of all, rubber. Vietnamese farmers were forced off lands their families had worked for generations to make way for rubber plantations owned by French corporations. This economic bleeding was paired with a campaign of cultural erasure. The French language became the language of power, and Catholicism was pushed on a traditionally Buddhist population. This isn't just a tale of communism versus capitalism. In the middle of the 19th century, while America was heading towards its own civil war, European powers were carving up the globe. This was not a friendly takeover. The French colonial system was built on brutality and exploitation. But the Vietnamese had a long, proud history of fighting off foreign invaders, especially the Chinese. As the 19th century bled into the 20th, that scattered resistance began to transform. It evolved into organized, modern nationalist movements. And among them was one young man who would change everything. In 1919, as the world's most powerful leaders met at the Versailles Peace Conference to carve up the world after World War I, Ho Chi Minh showed up in Paris with a petition. That rejection was a turning point. It convinced Ho and countless others that begging for decency from their colonial rulers was a waste of time. Ho Chi Minh traveled the world, saw the Russian Revolution, and came to believe that communism offered the best path to freeing his nation. Then, in 1945, the world turned on its head. Japan surrendered, and World War II was over. But that dream of a free, peaceful Vietnam was shattered almost instantly. The breaking point came in November 1946. A squabble over who should collect customs fees in the port city of Haiphong blew up. This was a brutal, full-scale war that raged for 8 long years. So the French are defeated. But as we know, the story doesn't end there. The French defeat at Dien Bien Phu forced the world's powers to the negotiating table in Geneva, Switzerland. That election never happened. The United States, which hadn't signed the accords, was convinced that Ho Chi Minh would win that election in a landslide. And this is where the American story really starts. But you have to see that the conflict that followed wasn't a new war. So when did the Vietnam War actually start? It wasn't with the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964.